Good afternoon and welcome to the latest episode of Blether, Thegither, the National's weekly show discussing politics and news from Scotland and around the world. My name is Stephen Paton, I'm representing the National today, and joining me in the studio is Nat Williams from Common Space and Emma Ritch, who is the Executive Director of Engender Scotland, who is joining us today to have a little bit of a chat about the rape clause, which you'll have seen in the news. And so obviously that is a little bit of a warning for anyone who's tuning in that we are going to be discussing some quite heavy subjects today, so if that's not your bag, then now is the time to go. But to everyone else, thank you for joining us. As always, we do want to hear your comments throughout, so please do leave them down below. We will be keeping an eye on them throughout the show to hear what you think about what we're talking about, as well as to give us a little bit of feedback as we go along. And a very quick technical point before we begin: we have been getting some feedback that the audio has been a bit squiffy at times during these broadcasts. We have taken it in and we're sorting it out for next week's show, so you'll have even better audio next time round. So Emma, Engender Scotland, can you tell me a wee bit about what the charity is and
Sure.
what our organisation does?
Yeah, we're Scotland's feminist organisation, so we work to advance women's equality, social, economic and political.
Great. And for anyone who doesn't know, the rape clause is this kind of new legislation coming in, or rather a part of it anyway, to do with getting benefits essentially, or and limiting it to only the first two children being eligible to have like child welfare paid on them, unless any children after that can be proven to have came around as a product of rape.
Yeah, mostly. So to go back a bit, a year ago, the Welfare Reform and Work Bill was enacted, became an act, a UK Parliament piece of legislation, and that set a limit on family size. And this is for in-work benefits. So this isn't the benefits cap, which is its own special challenge for the poorest people in the UK. This was something targeted at child tax credits, and also eventually, once it's implemented, the child element of universal credit. And it said you can only have two children. The UK government created a space for themselves to set out some exemptions, and they have just done that in a hasty, almost secret way, and all of those exemptions come into force today, and that includes the rape clause.
Okay, so what do you think the sort of impact is going to be of this legislation?
Well, the overall impact of the legislation is going to be to push around 200,000 children into poverty fairly immediately. There are about 875,000 families in the UK that have more than two children and who receive child tax credits, and that's going to have a kind of immediate impact on the incomes of those families. There are a lot of single-parent-headed households in there, principally headed by women, so women and children's poverty essentially will dramatically increase. The rape clause is horrifying, I think, to everyone who's heard about it, that we've talked about it to, and that is going to require women whose third or subsequent children have been conceived in what the UK government calls non-consensual conception, so arising from rape or in the context of coercive control, so domestic abuse. They will have to fill out a form and then take it to someone to get what's called a third-party referrer to endorse the fact that their child has come about as a result of rape or domestic abuse. In Scotland, there are no third-party referrers signed up. No public body or charity has agreed to be a third-party referrer, and the DWP has nonetheless implemented this policy today.
So what does that mean for people in Scotland who are trying to apply for this?
It's absolutely unclear. The DWP contacted Rape Crisis Scotland yesterday, the day before this came into force, and Rape Crisis Scotland asked them what will women do, how will women go about applying for this, and there was no answer. There's a kind of vague sense that health providers, as yet undefined, will step into the gap. None have agreed to do this, none have been trained, and the Royal College of Nursing came out today and said they see it as completely incompatible with the role of a health provider, so the nurses and midwives represented by them will not be doing this.
So other than the fact that it seems like it's going to be very difficult to actually roll out in Scotland if there are no third-party providers. There's also, obviously substantial issues in other areas as well. Like, it seems to me one of the issues with this clause is that it completely overlooks the fact of where rape tends to occur. Obviously, there's the myth that it's just something that happens while you're out and about, but the reality is it tends to be someone close to the person it happens to, whether it's family or friends, and it does mean that they're going to be in a position where, in order to continue maintaining that income that they need for their children, they're going to have to potentially put themselves into a dangerous situation for those around them.
That's absolutely right. So one of the things that the form that women fill in, and which is circulating now on Twitter, has asked women to do is to say that they're not living with the perpetrator. So if this happened in a context of domestic abuse, women have to leave the household. And as 40 years of evidence tells us, the most dangerous time for women living in a context of coercive control is when they leave. That's the point at which they're most likely to be murdered or injured severely. So the state is really asking women to choose between a rock and a hard place, between impoverishment and trauma and possibly death.
So it's another sort of welfare reform that's ultimately going to see women and children be disproportionately affected.
Absolutely. Although it's hard to tell that from what the UK government has said about it, because not only is there what's called an equality impact assessment, where they're supposed to look at the impacts on different groups, including women and men, that hasn't been done properly at all, but the whole process of the rape clause has been carried out almost in secret. So Alison Theilis MP has asked 25 questions in the House about it, and it hasn't been debated, it hasn't been scrutinised. Only now, once it's come into law, are the post-legislative scrutiny bodies in the House of Lords finally getting a chance to look at it, and their report suggested they are as appalled by it as is the women's sector.
And Nat, do you think there's been an element of almost political games in this? I mean, like Emma's saying, it's gone through, no one's really seen it, now it's sort of reached a stage where it's starting to get harder to actually deal with it. I mean, what's been happening in that area?
No, I think Emma's absolutely right in that it's hard to overstate the sort of callousness in which this policy has been pushed through in a very secretive manner. I mean, I think this is an example of how ideologically fanatical this government is, especially when it comes to an agenda of austerity. We know that economic measures in order to push forward an agenda of austerity affect women and hit women harder than anyone in society. I think it's 86% of the austerity cuts since 2010 have fallen on the shoulders of women. I think that's an Engender from an Engender report. And the government has charities and bodies, groups which are constantly involved in the consultation process. It has MPs on the opposition benches constantly trying to actually bring some sort of accountability to the table, and it's ignored all of the advice from charities, it's ignored all of the sort of countenance from MPs, and it's to do with this ideological obsession with balancing the books, with drawing down debt, regardless of the effect it has on individuals and families and women. So I think this is an example of ideological zeal, and it's also really, the government says that it would be committed to an equality impact assessment, but that's to do with the fundamental tension between being a government dedicated to economic competition and division, but also on one hand, paying lip service to the idea of equality. And as we've seen today, that's totally unsustainable.
And like you're saying about involving charities, like the UK government did ask charities in Scotland to step up and almost help them bring in the means of gauging whether or not someone who'd submitted a form actually was telling the truth on it or not. I know that Rape Crisis Scotland and Scottish Women's Aid were both asked to do it, and I think their response was just, we trust women.
Yeah. We won't collude and become an arm of the state interrogating women's truthfulness or not. I think was a very clear and honourable position that Rape Crisis Scotland and Scottish Women's Aid both took. I'd also add to that although the UK government did have a very brief consultation period on this policy, DWP put out a consultation, we had a month to respond. They've tried really hard not to listen to charities. We've noted with quite a lot of interest that the national organisations that look at rape and domestic abuse in Wales, in Northern Ireland, and in Scotland are all absolutely unwilling to go ahead with this. There's a different situation in England, and English organisations funded by UK government have inserted into their funding agreements the notion that they won't lobby the government, they won't try to influence their policy and political objectives if they provide services. And so I think they've tried to shield themselves as much as they could from our criticism. Obviously in Scotland we have much wider latitude to present that to them.
And have you seen the form?
I have seen the form.
Yeah, it's kind of horrifying.
It's absolutely horrifying, yeah. I mean, I think the overall policy is predicated on a number of horrifying thoughts about whether women who are poorer and families who are poorer should be allowed by the state to have more than 2 children. It's not predicated on any understanding of human life as we know it at all. So I think the rape clause is chilling. I think the idea that the state should decide how many children families have is equally horrifying to us.
But surely not just that particular aspect is worrying, that the state is saying how many kids you can or cannot have, but also the fact that fundamentally it does seem to be built on this premise that women will lie. They will lie about this to try and maintain receiving welfare for the amount of children that they've got, which is ultimately where a lot of this form and this clauses came in.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, the rape clause, the implementation of it is predicated on the idea that women will lie about this. And there's a whole bunch of really complicated possible side effects that DWP don't appear to have considered. So we and Scottish Women's Aid and Rape Crisis Scotland are very concerned, for instance, that the defence in a criminal case could try and bring in women's failure to apply for this as evidence that women are not telling the truth when they make a complaint of rape or sexual assault or domestic abuse in criminal proceedings. So there's and DWP appears not to have thought about that at all. So there's a whole set of ramifications around women's experience of violence that has just not been considered at all.
Okay, we've got a question actually coming in from Harry Dithwaite, who wants to know how many people are going to be affected by this change to the child benefit rules. So
it's going to be about 100,000 children across the UK in the next year. So there's going to be kind of third or more children born to about 100,000, and those figures are from the Child Poverty Action Group. We don't know how many children are going to be affected by the rape clause. No one has any good modelling on the likelihood of rape resulting in pregnancy in the instance when that would add a third or greater number of children to a family. So the DWP has not looked at this, and we have no idea what government has thought privately about this because it's never been looked at within Parliament. So there's a whole number of questions that just have not been able to be put to them.
And what do you think the next steps really should be that the government should be taking in an ideal scenario?
In an ideal scenario, they would be scrapping the rape clause, but they'd also be getting rid of the family cap, which is a breach of women's human rights and an intervention which is not able to be supported by the evidence. This was tried by Clinton's America in the 90s, and it didn't result in fewer children, it just resulted in more poverty.
And do you think we're likely to see the government back down on this now?
Oh, no chance. I mean, there's no sort of real political consequence for them pushing it through in terms of political party terms. This is a policy that they can force through because it's part of their wider austerity agenda. And I think I remember talking to Eddie Whiteford, the SNP MP, who is very instrumental in the Istanbul Convention and the achieving of that in its third reading of the bill. And she was saying that she's made overtures in terms of talking to MPs, Tory MPs who are women, MPs on the government benches who would be sympathetic to actually having another look at this. But it's about the DWP and it's about the Treasury as well. And the hostility of the Treasury to any climb down on a policy like this will be furious. So I don't think we can anticipate that.
And if people do want to kind of find out more, because like we're talking about earlier on, there's obviously myths, there's misconceptions, there's misunderstandings in a lot of ways. If people are interested to find out more for themselves about the realities of what this clause is ultimately going to bring down on them, where can they go?
They can go to our website, engender.org.uk, and we've got on our blog an explainer, 5 things you need to know about the rape clause and the family cap, which is a pithy, short summary of what all this means. And we've also got a lot of really deep, nerdy cuts on secondary legislation and all kinds of other supporting materials, as well as what we sent to the DWP.
And there is actually a campaign to stop the rape clause as well.
There's certainly been, I think, a groundswell of effort targeted now at this kind of slightly esoteric committee of the House of Lords. Where we can actually go next is seeing how that process rolls out, but then I think we're going to be looking at legal challenges after that.
Great. Well, thank you very much for coming in and having to chat with us about that.
Thanks.
Yeah, and you can find it more, like you say, on the Engender website. So thank you to everyone who has been commenting along. We still do want to hear from you. And for anyone tuning in, you are watching Blether, Thegither, which is our weekly breakdown of news and politics in Scotland and around the world. Also in the news this week, Brexit, funnily enough, that's kind of just still rolling on and will be. It's going to be, I know, it just keeps getting better. And we're going to war with Spain. That's exciting.
Yeah, I mean, this is. It's a hilarious story in the sense that it's really classic sort of sabre rattling. But there is an important thing that comes out of sort of the comic display of a former Tory party leader talking about taking the navy to the Spanish, and that's really a sense of identity crisis at the heart of the British state. What we're seeing is a state which is in sort of a weird position of delusion. It feels as though it should regain its imperial past. This didn't necessarily surprise me, because when Theresa May signed the Article 50 letter, I think Jacob Rees-Mogg stood up in the chamber afterwards during the debate and said, I think what we need is for the Ramonas to step down. We need to regain the spirit of Sir Francis Drake, kind of alluding to the commander who defeated the Spanish Armada. And that's very much the mentality that's driving some of the key ministers behind Brexit. It's their mentality when it comes to the negotiations of trade. It's the idea of Britain regaining its imperial heritage, regaining a sense of itself as a big player on the world stage outside the EU. And of course this doesn't bear any relation to reality at all. And I think what's going to be really dangerous is what happens when reality clashes with that imperial nostalgia. What happens when the trade negotiations go poorly? What happens when the EU supports Spain or simply suggests that the UK should stop talking about gunboats? That's going to be the real test, and to see the reaction of the Prime Minister or the government will be a real treat.
And I think that's been mirrored as well in some of the data that's been coming out after the vote itself as well. The YouGov poll that showed something like 50% of people who voted to leave also supported things like bringing back kind of older methods of measurements, bringing back just the blue passports, this weird focus on the blue passports, but even further back to the fact that Britain's always regarded itself as, if we go anywhere else, it's expats, but if anyone comes here, it's immigrants. This concept that it's, again, backed up by data, that more people in Britain think it's okay for us to go work anywhere, but not vice versa, of people coming to the UK. I think in a way that is, as we've discussed before, there were complex and nuanced reasons that people voted to leave the EU, but it's undeniable that there was still a core element of it that's just harking back to the good old days that never existed. The same kind of wave that got Trump elected in America with this Make America Great Again. And it is interesting to see how things will go when the reality of a modern Europe comes up against this sort of idealised British Empire that's sort of trying to get its head back up again, and it's just not going to have any of that. And I think it's interesting that the first time it popped its head up, it immediately turned to, so we're going to war with Spain, right? And that was almost like the first thing of just like straight in there with this like very aggressive tactic, which I find a bit concerning. But I mean, yeah, it will be interesting to see how things develop.
Yeah, I mean, it was also interesting thinking about Sigmar Gabriel, is the German foreign minister, previously the vice-chancellor under Merkel. So he came to London yesterday, and there's a surreal spectacle of him in the Foreign Office with Boris Johnson. And Boris Johnson says, oh, well, you know, if we don't get a deal, we'll just walk away, it'll be absolutely fine. And then the translation goes, and you hear Gabriel listening to it, and then he says, yeah, that's going to be harder on you than it is for us. So you're starting to get this kind of loggerheads mentality, and it's something that I think the UK has to realise, regardless of whether you'll leave or remain, that really it's not going to be about the trade negotiations. It's not going to be about sort of a loss of economic dynamism. What I'm really concerned at is the potential for progressive forces to be even more demised within the UK. We're already seeing, obviously the war on women in terms of austerity, in terms of the way in which our economics is gendered in such an unbalanced fashion. We look at the war on immigrants, we look at deportations, we look at obviously sentiments such as bringing back hanging. This regressive politics has potential to really grow in a UK which is disappointed with the deal that it thought it was getting, at least the Leave side of the vote.
I think that's right. I think we took a look at the Brexit white paper, and I think it mentioned human rights once and women not at all, and there's just no sense that broadly progressive values are at all part of this whole process. And I think the question of hanging and the return of the death penalty is just one of those things that really indicates how adrift from the modern European values. We'd have to leave the European Convention on Human Rights if we reintroduce the death penalty. I sense perhaps for some in the current UK government that wouldn't be much of a problem, but it's certainly starkly at odds with where civic society is in Scotland.
Yeah, I think as well this idea of, as you say, taking away the European Convention on Human Rights and replacing it with a British Bill of Rights. For me, the kind of most spine-chilling thing is the fact that the word human isn't there. It's British, which, given the UK's poor treatment of immigrants and to an extent refugees as well, is already very concerning that they're willing to take out that element of it to focus it in on, again, this identity as a Brit being the fundamental thing that secures those rights for you within this country.
And another instance of where Northern Ireland and the massive constitutional complexities, as well as Scotland, obviously, and Wales, are just missing entirely from the discussion and the debate. It does seem that the UK government's shelved the notion of the British Bill of Rights for the meantime, but certainly this Great Repeal Bill, the Brexit process, those things need to have human rights embedded within them as processes and as content, and we're not seeing any indication that that's going to be the case.
Yep, and with the repeal bill as well, Matt, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges that that's going to face, or rather that people are going to face from that? Like, obviously the UK government's going to take back all this power and then kind of decide where it needs to go as a result of that.
Yeah, so the worst thing about the Great Repeal Bill is the use of executive power by UK ministers, the so-called sort of Henry VIII clauses, and in a sense what it means is the potential for the devolution settlement in Scotland and Wales and in Northern Ireland to be all impinged, for new powers not only to be not given to Holyrood and to Cardiff, but or Stormont, but also for powers to be withdrawn from those assemblies. I think people are starting to realise actually how fragile the UK constitution is. I mean, just as Emma was saying, the complete absence of coverage on Northern Ireland in any depth. You really have to scour Twitter or talk to Northern Irish sources to actually find out what's happening there. But I think on a whole range of issues like Emma was talking about, with human rights being embedded at the idea of what the British state is and British society, that's going to be massively under threat, because UK ministers will have the right to pick and choose what they want to convert from European law into British law. And I think the options for the opposition, the resistance to Brexit are really, we're going back to legal challenges, we're going back to putting pressure on MPs through ordinary citizens lobbying. It's going to take a lot of time and effort from new sources of the media and old to hold the government to account. But in reality, we're dealing with a government with a huge majority here. Politically, in terms of parliamentary votes, there's not much that can be stopped. I think the conversation then goes on to issues around devolution and the devolved settlement and the constitutional crisis in Scotland. So I suppose the argument from the Scottish Government's end is, well, the only way in which to safeguard the principles of devolution and Holyrood is to gain independence. And that debate has been obviously going on since the SNP conference and in Aberdeen and before that. So we're going to see an intensification of that debate north of the border. It's going to be really interesting, and especially at Common Space, we're looking at the Scottish Conservatives in the sense of, obviously, outwardly they say they support Holyrood, they support the institutions of Scottish governance and devolution. It's going to be incredibly awkward for them when new powers are not devolved, substantial powers, when it looks like Holyrood will be open to the threat of powers being weakened, that's going to be incredibly awkward, and we're certainly going to be on the case, and we hope other media are too.
Not just the Conservatives, but the Labour Party as well, who've consistently spoken about this concept of solidarity and the strength of our union, who are now kind of jonesing for this federal solution across the UK. I mean, when not only does that not materialise, but actually the opposite, where we see more powers becoming centralised back in Westminster again, they're going to be in a very difficult position to continue arguing the case for unionism, which is what I said at the time when they first announced this federal push, that this could only blow up in their faces and become a reason for them to either look like they are completely spineless or hypocrites. There's no way out, I think, for them in this situation. And we'll come back to the Great Repeal Bill in a little bit, actually. But first of all, just kind of still in the vein of Brexit, one of the other interesting things that's come out this week has been the EU Parliament voting to recognise Scotland's Remain vote. Which is really fascinating, because for a long time there's been discussions around whether or not Scotland realistically will be able to step into the EU, whether Scotland meets the criteria for remaining within the EU. It does feel like there are, at least the beginning of the hand of friendship being extended across, that Scotland wants to remain in, and as well as a very popular myth, the myth that Spain would block Scotland's access to the EU, essentially biting the dust in its entirety when Spain came out and said, we will not block Scotland's entry to the EU. And that's been something that's been discussed for a long time, and people on the yes side have certainly been arguing that Spain would not do that. This certainly feels, now that it's gained more mainstream coverage, that's it. Like, that argument is dead now, and there's kind of no reviving that. It does seem like that's kind of reached its end. But now, we had a conversation last week as well about Scotland's potential place in the EU and how it might not all be as rosy as it seems.
Yeah, I'm not going to be very popular. I'm incredibly sceptical about... I mean, look, I'm someone who's obviously passionate about diplomacy, foreign policy, Scotland's position in the world. Massively impressed with Nicola Sturgeon going abroad and showing the image of a woman who's leading a country and progressive values on the international stage. With the EU parliamentary vote, it's certainly important symbolically. In terms of the way it's going to practically affect the vote, I think, yes, seeing a Spanish MP stand up and say that his country wouldn't block Scotland would make some impact. But fundamentally, I said this in a talk that I gave in Perth. No one can give you the political confidence to make a decision like whether you want to be independent from the UK or remain in it. You have to make that choice. I don't think actually that there are tons of people at home who are undecided who actually are thinking to themselves, this is the supreme moment that I'm going to make up my mind. I think it's important in terms of giving general symbolic credibility to the independence movement and to the sort of the cause of the yes side. But I think that actually the argument will be one based on sort of ordinary conversations with friends, with people on the doorstep. It's going to be on the issue of economics and the kind of country that Scotland can be in terms of sustaining progressive values outside the UK. That's what's really going to sway a lot of people who are undecided and have been undecided since 2014. So I'm encouraged by what we saw in the EU Parliament, but I'd caution about getting too excited, because I have a tendency to get really excited.
I think it's maybe an indicator of the extent to which some of these questions, which seem very technocratic, are actually extraordinarily political. So it's not that there's a set of rules that we have to decipher better. It's about the content of the vision we have more. And so we've seen very much Spain, I think, certainly the mood music changing as the realities of Brexit became apparent. But I think I entirely agree with that it has to be, any Scottish referendum discussion has got to be about the Scotland we want to see. And I think these details are sometimes quite off-putting when they delve into what seems to be the minutiae of law or the rules of institutions in a way that people really struggle to put into context and understand. The bit that was very exciting for Engender, we don't have a position on the constitutional position of the UK. Like charities, were prevented from articulating one. But what we found very exciting during the first independence referendum was that sense of imagining what Scotland could be like and ensuring that women's voices and women's equality was a central part of that. And it's the opportunities to have those kind of discussions I'm excited about with regards to a future Scottish referendum, and not the opportunity to pass out various treaties of the European Union.
But even in terms of engagement with women in politics as well, this week we've of course seen the figures for the council elections coming up in Scotland. And
Absolutely.
It's less than stellar. I mean, definitely some parties much worse than others, but we're still not really at that 50% threshold for any party, even if some party, well, the SNP and the Greens essentially are pulling that average up, whereas the Conservatives are at the other side of it, who are just essentially the pits. Has there been like a response from them around that was more than just, well, our Prime Minister is female, isn't that enough?
I think that has been pretty much the content of the response, and obviously Ruth Davidson, being the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, has been cited as well. We have seen figures like this over and over again throughout the lifetime of Scottish local authorities and also in the Scottish Parliament. I think the time for action is now, really. We need to stop lamenting over the figures and do something about it, really. And there are powers which the Scottish Parliament could use to try and introduce more effective balancing measures for local government. So we would urge them to get on and do it.
Action, not words.
Indeed, absolutely.
Absolutely. So the Great Repeal Bill, coming back to this, there was quite an interesting development, and normally in this show I do a little section on, Stephen loves renewables, and I talk about that for a little bit. And I am going to do that, but we're going to do it in a longer section than normal now, because the Great Repeal Bill has actually brought up a very interesting question, and it was raised by Richard Dixon, the director of Friends of the Earth Scotland, and part of what's coming back to the UK at the moment is also going to be the power to set targets for renewables, essentially. Okay, and at the moment it seems like that it will probably end up back at Westminster, even though under the Scotland Act it should come to the Scottish Parliament. But it's in that weird limbo where, as much as the UK government is saying, of course we're not going to do this, then they'll turn around and say not that long afterwards, it's like, well, we need to make sure that these powers are setting at the right levels of government. So, I mean, we'll have to see where that goes. But at the moment, the kind of industry in Scotland, it's got about 20,000 jobs, are really depending on it, looking at about £1 billion of investment provided by it. And at the moment, the Scottish Government can set its own targets, and it has been doing so. Brussels has set their targets, and the Scottish Government has set slightly higher ones as a result to kind of hit where it wants to go. The issue is that if that power then comes back to Westminster and they set much lower targets, which realistically, given their focus on both nuclear and fracking, is likely to be the case, even if the Scottish Government does then set higher targets above that, the UK energy market is still ultimately going to be dominated by what's happening in England, surely because of the size of it, the size of the market, and that's where a lot of the investment will be going. So at the moment, Scotland is facing a little bit of a sugary future in terms of what it can do with its renewables, and that's frustrating me a lot because I love renewables, obviously. And there's been some really interesting developments. Even just this week alone, the First Minister is currently over in America doing deals with California. In March alone, through wind power, we managed to reach like 58% of Scotland's electricity needs just from wind, which is an 81% increase from last year. There's a lot happening and there's a lot of investment, and with so much going on as well within like the kind of the divestment movement, which is very successful in starting to get councils and universities to begin moving away from investing in these dirty energies, to then have the UK government just kill its targets and drop them right down again. It's going to be a massive kick at that movement, I think, and the repercussions of it are not going to be particularly positive in terms of encouraging people to invest in an industry that, quite frankly, a lot of people see as being something that we can deal with later on, rather than being a very urgent industry that needs investment in it. Just now, I don't know what either of you think about if that power went back to Westminster, if we'd like to see a sort of a slowing down of the investment in renewables in Scotland as a result of it.
In many ways, we already are when it comes to a lot of onshore projects, actually, because if you look at what the UK government did between 2015 and 2016, there was a cut in subsidy. So it became harder for communities to put forward claims on land, to partner up with small companies and venture capital funds in order to build projects. I think the general issue around this is the lack of ability, or the way that it cuts Scotland's ability to make a future and an industrial future based on renewable energies. And it affects the argument as well, it affects the fundamental economy of Scotland, and it affects the argument of the constitution and also economic prosperity, because it means if the argument runs that Scotland has lots of oil, plenty of oil, don't worry, it's not running out, right? Plenty of oil. If the argument runs that, in fact, the oil will run out in 2 years' time, then surely the logic is to invest in renewables. Surely the argument is to invest heavily in clean energy, rather than putting your country in a situation, whether this is the UK or Scotland, where it doesn't have a sustainable source of energy. And this means a lack of security. We've already seen a massive political turmoil coming out of countries like Estonia and Poland, Lithuania, even Sweden, over the Nord Stream pipeline between Russia and those countries. Now, there's lots of debate from the UK government around energy security. How can you ensure energy security in the UK or in Scotland if Scotland doesn't have the ability to set its own targets, doesn't have the ability to raise capital spending, capital investment as an independent country, to invest in renewables like wind, hydro, tidal wave energy, and expand those into a new industry? So this is really about economic prosperity, future planning, and the security of the nation.
And ultimately, jobs to a very large degree. Like Scotland has the potential to become a world leader in certain industries, like for example dismantling the oil structures that we've already got in place. And the fact is, if there isn't movement on that now, other countries will be so skilled at it by the time that we get round to it that it doesn't matter how good we are, they are already world leaders in it, and we're far behind as a result of that. And like you say, I think you're right that the UK government's current record on renewables since the new Conservative government was elected has absolutely shown, I think, that it will not be a positive move with regards to renewables if that power is devolved back to the UK Parliament rather than the Scottish Parliament. Great. Well, that's my chat about renewables done for this week. More of that next time. And that's starting to bring us towards the end of this week's show, so thank you to everyone who has tuned in. But before we go, as always, we will play our fun game of Did They Tweet It, where I will have chosen a random person on the Intersphere, and I'm going to read out 3 tweets. 2 of them are real, 1 of them is false, and my guests have to work out which are the false tweet.
Oh God.
Yeah, I know, this is the fun part. I will eventually get a board and we can keep track of who's winning. And this week I decided to focus on Ed Miliband. Because Ed Miliband got really sassy, like after the whole
Millibay.
Yeah, exactly, the Millie fandom. But kind of after the whole prime ministerial elections, and then he doesn't win, and he kind of steps out of Twitter for a little while, and then suddenly out of nowhere he just comes back with all of this sass. And part of me is kind of like, where was this during the election campaign? How different things may have been if people had actually been able to relate to you a little bit more as a human being.
Well, you tried to eat a bacon sandwich.
Did try to eat a bacon sandwich. And there was
less Ed Stone, a bit more sass.
Okay, I will fight to my last day. I liked the Ed Stone. Controversial opinion, but I saw where they were going with it. I appreciated it. It was a time in politics when everything just seemed like nobody was willing to commit to anything. He was like, I will put it in stone. Put it out there.
That will make a difference.
Yeah. I think it was a nice idea, if questionable. Also, my favourite story about the Ed Stone as well is just the fact that in those final days of the campaign, when there was so little communication between anybody in Labour, apparently one of the top advisors had no idea that Ed Stone was coming until it was on live television in front of them, and they were in the office and they saw the Ed Stone being unveiled, and they just started screaming and screaming and screaming, and no one knew why. But we've got 3 tweets from Ed Miliband, and you're going to work out which ones are real and which ones are false. Okay, here we go. Tweet number 1. This was in reply to James Blunt saying that he'd secretly been editing Ed Miliband's Twitter account, or guest editing it for the last couple of weeks. And Ed Miliband responded with, I hope your songs are better than your ability to keep secrets. Number 2. Breaking. I will shortly be announced as the editor of Heat magazine. And number 3. Things would have worked out differently if I'd taken that offer to lead One Direction. So if there's 3 tweets,
Number 3.
which are real, I think so. So either between James Blunt, Heat magazine, or One Direction.
Because I've seen the first 2, but I thought they were like from a parody account, so I'm not sure.
Or maybe they are.
Yeah.
Maybe they are.
I think 3 is fake as well.
Can I
I'm
go
not
3?
100% sure on that Ed Sheeran one, but I'm fairly certain of the Heat magazine one.
Okay.
Obviously in response to the appointment of George Osborne.
Yes, wow. You're correct that the second one is real. That came from in response to George Osborne. But the Ed Sheeran one.
Kind of a bit heartbroken, to be honest.
No, sorry, not Ed Sheeran. James Blunt. Not Ed
Oh,
Sheeran.
sorry, James Blunt.
James Blunt, yeah. Throw myself there as well. James Blunt one is also true. So you both got it right. It was things would have worked out differently if I'd taken that offer to lead One Direction. Is false. However, I don't think we can deny for a second that would not have been true. Both politically in the UK and in the music industry. Can you imagine?
If
Anyway.
Harry Styles was Prime Minister.
I don't know if anyone's prepared for that. But that does bring us to the end of this week's show. So thank you very much to everyone who tuned in, commented and shared the video. As always, we do still want to hear your feedback, so please do pop it down below. And thank you very much to both my guests for coming in and joining me today to talk about everything what happened since last Thursday. We will be back again next Thursday at 3 p.m, so please do tune in then. Thank you very much, and we'll see you all next week. Hello.